So because all these groups were not really getting along in terms of what they wanted and their points of view, there was ultimately a rebellion in Lower Canada. And this started in 1837, and before that, there were little things that were changing that were affecting how these groups were living together. So in 1822, the English merchants went to the British government, and they wanted to unite the two Canadas. They wanted to unite Upper and Lower Canada. And ultimately, the French citizens went to their leader, who is Papineau. Can't really pronounce his name. So they went to their French leader, and they had formed a political party known as the Parti Canadien. And they asked their leader, Papineau, to go to the British government and go against the English merchants and say, no, we should not unite the Canadas. The Canadas should remain apart, and they cannot work together. You can already see that there's friction. So basically the British government agreed with the French, and they decided to leave the Canadas as they are, make sure they have the same kind of government but two sets of government. So in 1834, the Legislative Assembly in Lower Canada decided to make a list of things that they wanted out of the British government, and they called this list the 92 Resolutions. There were 92 things that they demanded of the British government. Out of these 92 demands, only 10 were actually listened and followed by the British government, which angered, of course, the French even more. By 1837, the French had already felt so much resistance for the British government, felt so ignored, and felt fear and pressure from all these immigrants that were coming in, that were changing their ways, that were making sure that there was a smaller population of French-speaking people and a larger population of English-speaking people, because they were coming from Britain and Wales and France and Ireland and Scotland. And they had already been facing a wave of economic depression because so much of the timber and the agriculture that was being sold to America and Britain was sold at such a low price that people really couldn't afford to live. So they were facing poverty and starvation, and they were dealing with a lot of things that they felt was the British government's fault. Ultimately, this led to a rebellion in November, and the French people, led by the Parti Canadien, went against the British government and fought in many small cities in Quebec. And they had actually achieved one victory. Of course, ultimately the British won out because they overran them in December of that rebellion. So in December of that same year, the British militia had taken over the French People's Rebellion and had ultimately destroyed their Parti Canadien by having them scatter, by burning down churches and burning down large parts of cities, and having their leader, Papineau, basically escape to America. And they basically lost their rebellion. Okay, so while all this dissent and infighting between the British and the French was happening in Lower Canada, things were changing in Upper Canada as well. So Upper Canada had the Family Compact, which was, again, a small group of elites, so very rich, wealthy people who had high positions in government. And these people, again, similar to the Chateau clique in Lower Canada, only really cared about power and gaining more power in government. And what they were doing was they were giving their friends and their families positions in government as well, and they were giving them jobs and money and housing and land in Upper Canada. And of course, the other people in the community, so the people, new immigrants and people who had been settling the land, realized this and noticed how unfair this was, and they formed a group called the Reformers. So the Reformers were opposed to these elites. They did not like what they were doing in the British government in Upper Canada. And they were led by William Lyon Mackenzie. So what they wanted was a change in government. They no longer wanted this British system of government where the monarchy was on top and everyone was basically led by these British elites, and no one had any power and no one had any control. So what they did was they voted for and they opted for the American system of democracy, and every election, that's what they were petitioning for in the Legislative Assembly. So during elections, there was a lot of fighting and a lot of battles that were happening because people knew if you were a reformer or if you were part of the Family Compact, because votes were public. So whenever you'd vote, people would see who you would vote for. And if they didn't like you, if you were a reformer, they didn't like you, they would actually physically fight you in the streets because of this. So ultimately, there was a rebellion in Upper Canada as well. So what they had seen the French do in Lower Canada, the reformers wanted to do in Upper Canada as well. So this group, led by Mackenzie, decided to actually fight the British, and they were known as the Radicals because they wanted to physically fight the British government for ignoring their pleas and ignoring them in these higher levels of government. And in December of 1837, the same year and around the same time as the French people in Lower Canada were having their rebellion, the British reformers in Upper Canada were decided to fight their rebellion as well. So these radicals went to Toronto, and they went to fight the British militia directly on Yonge Street, actually. And they fought them, and they ultimately lost because they were men with sticks facing men with guns. And once they lost, Mackenzie fled to America, just as the French leader in Lower Canada fled to America as well. And some rebels were actually hanged for treason because they had decided to go against the British government. And because of this, ultimately, this loss and this fear led everyone to stop fighting and stop going against the British government. And that's where we end in 1837. Okay?